Okay, so with Chapter 5 of Arknights right around the corner, that means a very special character is going to become playable. Now, if you don't want any spoilers, click away right now, but if you already know who I'm talking about, I mean, look, it's Chen, okay? It's Chen. She's gonna be added to the game. Look at her skills. I don't care if her S2 looks better than her S3. Look at her S3. It's gorgeous. Anyway, Chapter 5, Necessary Solutions, comes with a trailer, and there's this one particular scene from the trailer that really stands out to me. Take a look. See, I love that shot, and I don't know why it stands out to me more than any other shot, but if you know me, I gotta recreate it. So first things first is we're gonna choose a character. See, I was gonna do Silver Ash at first, but I didn't think he'd fit this type of scene, so I went for Texas instead. Now see, Texas is great. If you're not using her, use her. Okay, taking a look at Texas's regular art, it's good and it really fits her, but I think her E2 is what really stands out because she's got the 2 swords that she likes as well. Once we yoink that off of Google, we'll be good to go. First thing we're gonna do is pop open Photoshop and remove all the shit that isn't Texas. And we're gonna be doing this because I can tell through experience that the silhouette of the E2 art isn't so great. Like, imagine it this way, if you made everything pure black, you wouldn't be able to tell Texas apart from the background. I tried my luck here with Photoshop's like auto select and it actually did a pretty good job. It seems like my RNG luck has gone to Photoshopping instead of my gacha pools. That being said though, the auto isn't perfect, so I'm gonna have to go in here and use my lasso tool to manually select everything. Now here I'm using the polymerization preparation tool instead of the regular lasso tool because I have finer control over it. Some people say not to use the poly lasso tool because it leaves you with sharp edges, and to them I say congratulations, you won't grow up with arthritis. Anyway, I was really surprised at how low the quality of her art is. By that, I don't mean it's bad art. What I mean is that once you zoom in, it really feels like you're looking at a Pokemon sprite, but bigger. Okay, so now that we're done with the selections, I turn her into a silhouette just to see how she'd look like in the final render. I also turned her original E2 art into a silhouette just to prove my earlier point that it's very unclear what everything is. Once the silhouette is cleaned up, I start cleaning her actual sprite up. Now there's a part of her like light katana that cuts through her right leg here, so what we're gonna do is act like a complete idiot and forget how to select just that part for about 5 minutes, and then remember what I'm actually trying to do and use Photoshop's content aware fill to try to automatically remove the light sword. It's actually done a pretty decent job, but I still have to go in there and clean it up with the spot heal tool. And then I noticed that I've lost a lot of those Pokemon sprite artifacts, so it doesn't really match, so I borrowed some samples from the other leg just to make it fit a bit better. This entire process only took me about half an hour or so, so it was pretty easy. Okie dokie, so now we're in After Effects, my hometown. First thing we're gonna do is create a comp with a size of 1920 by 1080, then we're gonna drop in a black solid and add in a gradient ramp for the red glow. Then I'll also write in her name, Texas, and try to find the right font, size, and spacing. And keep in mind that as I'm doing this, I'm using the original Chen trailer as reference. So just there, I downloaded the Chen trailer and dropped it into After Effects as an overlay. So now it's a lot easier to try to match the spacing correctly. Now keep in mind, the original guy who created this didn't have any reference to go off of, so it's really just about finding what you think is right more so than trying to match something perfectly. If I was doing this all by myself with no reference, I wouldn't need to mimic the size and the spacing of the text, but in this case, I just wanted to get it as close as possible. Now we can drop in the isolated texas.png and start animating her to fit the right size. Now see, I actually made a mistake here of tweaking her position, which we don't want to do because she'll start sliding around, which kind of ruins the aesthetic. All we're going to animate is her scale. I'm also going to do this for the entire shot instead of just parts of the shot. This way, when I need to cut her out for the red scene later on, I've already got the animated data so I don't have to try to match her animation somehow. Now that part of the animation is done, I'm gonna start breaking it down part by part. Starting from the beginning, we see Chen's right side as she floats past for exactly 3 frames. I'm gonna get the rough positioning and animation done for this, and we'll tidy this up at the end. Next thing I'm gonna do is do the reveal from shadows. For this, I've duplicated the Texas layer and gave it a fill effect on the black color. At first, I animated the black Texas and lowered its opacity to reveal the full colored layer underneath. But this doesn't work because for whatever reason, the layer underneath shows up as this Okashi outline. So to fix that up, I simply put the full color layer above the black layer and then animated the opacity from 0 to 50%. Okay, next thing is to grab Texas's Chinese name, and for whatever reason, my fonts did not recognize the Sa in her name. Resolve that by finding a different font. Now there's just a slight problem here with lining up the font to the original Chen trailer because Chen's Chinese name is just Chen. But Texas's Chinese name is like De Ka Se Si, which is like 4 letters. It's not too big of a problem, we just have to make it fit. Now all we need to do is animate the text and fix up the curves. Again, we're animating the entire track instead of doing it bit by bit, so that later when we cut it up, we don't have to try to rematch the animation. Next up, I'm going to add the glitchiness to the text. For this, I downloaded a black and white glitch.mp4 file from Google, specifically a black and white file so I can use it as a Luma map, where the white parts are visible and the black parts are invisible. And I'm also going to use it as a displacement map, where the white parts move one way and the black parts move another. Once I set up the Luma map on these words, I'm going to parent the scale so that the glitch stays the same size as the text. After this, we're going to get some ball action going. That's actually what the effect is called, ball action. Yeah, this one's new for me as well. Ball action is basically how we set up this LED grid. It took a bit of fiddling to get it to work, and what you're seeing is not the final version. At first, I used the text as a mask for the LED grid, but then what you end up with is like half of an LED bulb instead of the full LED. Instead, what I had to do was copy and paste the effect onto the actual text layer itself. Once that was done, all that was left to do was to put them in the correct position. Then comes the time to distort the text. As mentioned before, the black and white glitch.mp4 file comes in handy here, as I can simply use it as a displacement map. Then I reposition these new elements into frame for the next 3 frames. After these 3 frames, it's time to make the main distorted text start scaling down. This one's pretty straightforward because I've already pre-animated the text moving, so all I had to do was apply the distortion effect. Now here comes the red scene. This is what I mentioned earlier. This one's pretty cool, but it only stays for like 3 frames. First thing we're gonna do is split up the footage for just the red part. Again, everything was pre-animated so it lines up without fail, and we're specifically splitting up the text's full color layer. Then we'll tint the layer and change all the white colors to red, and I also noticed that the black values for the original Chen image is black, but not so much for Texas, so to fix that I added a contrast effect to make the darks darker. With that done, now it's time to make the background red grid. For this, I created a red solid as a background and then applied the grid effect. I tweaked the grid until it looked right, and was originally planning to do this all on one layer. But later on, I decided to put the grid on a separate layer so I can add some extra detail onto just the grid lines. Once the grid looked right, I googled up a picture of a corkboard and used that as the background image and set the blend mode of the red layer to be darkened. Here's where I decided to split up the grid onto a separate layer and add a distortion to the grid itself. I settled with creating a fractal noise with a turbulent sharp profile and set the blend mode to stencil Luma so some parts of the grid would be thicker than others, giving it a hand-drawn vibe. About now is when I realized that the shot felt very flat, and that's because Texas is missing her shadow. This was simple enough. All I had to do was put on the drop shadow effect and tweak it until it looked good. Another note here is that there's actually a floating white scratchy texture on the original Chen footage, but I couldn't tell what that was, so I just skipped out on that for mine. The last thing here is the text, which again is simple enough because the text was already pre-animated. All I had to do was split up the original text layer and then change the color to black. And that's the red scene done. Now to create these 4 red cubes that float in. The way I did this is actually very bad because I basically relied on the template. The reason this is bad is because it would be very difficult to do without this template. So while the footage that you're watching right now shows me doing it in this bad way, I'll explain how you could do this without a template. Okay, so because there are these 4 red squares that all move towards the center of the screen at an even pace and don't change their individual positions, one of the ways that this could have been done by the original creator is that they could have made a big rectangle and used the corners of the rectangle as a gauge for where the red squares should go. This would work because the big rectangle would just scale down in size and all 4 corners would move evenly. Then he would just have to animate the 4 red squares following the corners of the big rectangle. He could have also parented the 4 red squares onto the big rectangle. Either way, he would have needed to draw one single red square and then set the anchor point to the middle of the square. This way he'd be able to duplicate it onto all 4 corners. He would have also needed to manually animate the scale of the 4 red squares as they shrink in size as well. Now, I don't know if there's a way to automate this, there might be, but I'm just not sure. If you guys have a way to do this faster or better than me, please let me know in the comments, I'd love to know. Either way, once the scaling and moving is complete, then it's about choosing the order of which the squares appear in and also the order in which they change from a filled square into a stroked square. Now I actually took the liberty here to add on to the original design by making the stroked version of the 4 red squares spin. I didn't include that part in this video because it was an afterthought, but you'll see it in the final version. In order to make them spin, it's as simple as adding a trim paths effect like any other moving path in After Effects. Okay, great, now the 4 red squares are done. Let's add in this LED bar next, and that just means more ball action and simple scaling. No problem there. Next is actually a really small detail that I didn't notice until I started working on this project. There's actually a blue thing behind Chen in the original trailer. Now, I've got no idea what that is, but I'm just gonna go with the penguin logo for Texas. All I did for this was rip the Penguin Logistics logo off of Google and put it into Photoshop to get rid of the background. But unfortunately, the quality of the logo was Minecraft, so I had to convert it into a vector graphic instead. This just means that I'm basically able to up-res the logo to any resolution that I want. But granted, it doesn't really matter too much here because it's going to be blurred out and faded. Once I'm done with the penguin logo, I import it to After Effects and I add the bevel effect to give it some highlights. Then I tint it blue, blur it out, and lower its opacity to make it more subtle. Next, we can start blending things in by adding a light wrap around Texas. Now, I don't know why I've never done this in all my years of using After Effects, but I learned how to do it just for this project, and I think it'll be a super useful skill that I can bring to my future projects as well. First thing I do is make the glowing elements glow by adding the glow effect. Whenever I use glow, I typically have 2 glows to mimic the inverse falloff, and inverse falloff is just how a real life light works, but the default single glow in After Effects is a linear falloff. Now, as you can see, After Effects' glow doesn't automatically light wrap around foreground layers. So in order to do the light wrap, we have to duplicate the glowing text layer and put it above Texas, then make it so that this new layer only appears on the edges of Texas. And we can do this using a combination of 3 effects. First, we put an inverted set matte effect, which means that the lights will only show up everywhere except where Texas is. Then we can put a channel blur on the alpha channel, meaning the edges of Texas gets blurred, which also means that some of the light is able to seep into Texas. Then finally, we put a regular set matte effect, so only the blurred lights inside of Texas are visible. It's a super cool effect and very simple to do as well. Finally, I added a little edge light around Texas by giving her the inner glow layer style and adjusting it until it looked right. Okay, and what you're seeing now is me re-adding that glow and light wrap effect onto the other spots where it's needed. After that, I'll also make Texas's swords glow, and that's pretty self-explanatory. But what you don't get to see is the 2 other tiny details being depth of field and motion blur. Typically, I just put motion blur onto everything, but we can't do this here because in this case, things are literally moving across the screen in 3 frames, and all you end up with is this big smudge. So I was very selective of what layers to put motion blur onto and made sure that it was super subtle. Then I also added depth of field onto Texas by having a camera blur effect and animating it so it would blur less over time. I also added some post-processing effects, specifically chromatic aberration. You ever watch any modern anime and wonder why some specific shots stand out and look so good? Chances are it's got the chromatic aberration effect on it. That's like when the edges of the frame get split into red and blues just like you're wearing 3D glasses. You know, chromatic aberration in real life is actually a result of a poor and cheap camera from the old days. Nowadays, chromatic aberration on modern high-quality cameras are so small it's virtually inexistent. Yet somehow, whenever people do any sort of animation, they pop in chromatic aberration and all of a sudden the shot looks 10 times better. I don't know what it is, I don't know the science behind it just works and that's good enough for me. Make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon to get notifications when I make the next video just like this. And also share this video with your friends if you really enjoyed it. Cheers!